at this point as Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson is speaking about housing affordability challenges and other policy issues. It's a symposium hosted by the National Housing Conference.
Opportunity to see many people that I hadn't seen for quite some time, and enjoyed meeting with some of the award winners. You know, last week HUD hosted a housing policy forum where I spoke about the state of the housing market. It's stable, secure, and sound. The market is safe. I want to emphasize that. And the market is in good shape. And much of the credit for that goes to the people in this room. After the turbulence of 2008, we must remain vigilant and very watchful and anticipate more than react. We must be prudent and practical, continue to maintain responsible lending practices. Wishful thinking cannot be our sole criteria for credit worthiness. And as the economy improves, we must never ignore the central role of housing in the recovery from the 2008 recession. Nationally, we must continue to smooth out the cycles that lead to burst bubbles and foreseeable foreclosures. We want to avoid anyone going underwater or losing their home. There's always room for improvement, more stability, more growth. We still see small fluctuations in the market, but the dramatic highs and lows seem to be smoothing out, and things are becoming much more predictable. The data now shows a reasonably straight and rising line on the upward trajectory, and the cycles have become much less dramatic. We're looking for good news in startups and inventory and among the many sides of home ownership. The home ownership rate today is 63.6%. In some states, upwards of 70%. And first-time home buyers make up to 35% of all home buyers in the last 12 months. This good news will continue. The Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies projects that the United States will add 13.6 million households over the next 8 years. The Federal Housing Administration has a strong role to play. FHA has helped more than 46 million Americans either obtain mortgages or refinancing. And an estimated 40% of all first-time home buyers use FHA. In fact, during the time that we spend here today, 4,000 new home buyers will be assisted by FHA. So the pace is really quite exciting. Now, this good news hides one story. The housing market is becoming a lost dream for many of the millennials. We must create a viable entryway for more credit-worthy millennials. First-time home buyers feel frozen out, and there is some new data from Ellie Mae showing in January that 35% of all FHA loans were closed by millennials, FHA. But I worry because there are reports from California, from the state legislature, that only about 13% of millennials buy a home. 13%, historical lows. Why? Well, the high prices of homes escalate out of reach for some. This is especially true in places like New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles. And so many of the people face very stark choices. Some see wages absorb 40, 50, and even 60% of housing costs. That's a catch-22 for them, because either you become house poor through a potential mortgage, if you can get one, and sacrifice all the other aspects of life, or you forego a home and have the other necessities of life. Even if you are credit worthy, these are tough choices that affect the future creation of wealth. and quality of life in this country. All of us have heard stories about millennials living at home, renting, sharing rooms. Many of these people are creditworthy, but feel excluded from the possibility of home ownership. You can understand their frustration, and it cuts across an entire age group. In the 1920s, Hemingway's contemporaries were famously called the lost generation. I worry that millennials may become a lost generation for home ownership, excluded from the American dream, punished as an unintended byproduct of the financial crisis in 2008. We must be mindful of this situation. We don't want to exclude a generation of buyers or even generations to come. We must do more, work for more, find reasonable, prudent pathways for millennials with investors and lenders in the housing market itself. Interestingly enough, at the beginning of this nation, people came here from all areas of the world, and they worked extremely hard. Not 8 hours a day, but 12, 16 hours a day, not 5 days a week, 6 or 7 days a week, no such thing as a minimum wage. Not for themselves, but for their children, for their grandchildren. There was always the thinking about the next generation, something we have to start doing again. We know that a first step toward home ownership is often the purchase of a condominium. A condo is often a step on the home ownership ladder and a way of moving up that ladder. And we know that FHA has a central role to play. It is the lender of choice for many first-time home buyers, and it's the entryway into the housing market. Today, let's find ways and means for credit-worthy first-time home buyers to enter the market. One way, I direct your attention to the Housing Opportunity Through Modernization Act of 2016. That act allowed FHA, under certain circumstances, to lower its required owner occupancy standard for approved condominium developments. The owner occupancy minimum has been reduced from 50% to 35%. Ultimately, this action will allow for more people, including millennials, to use FHA to buy condos. On Wednesday, Fannie Mae announced that it would reduce its debt-to-income ratio to attract more millennial home buyers. Such an action would help some millennials, although FHA loans would remain an attractive and powerful option. I welcome this action. In concert with our efforts, millennials will now have game-changing circumstances that should encourage home ownership. However, the federal government cannot be the only solution. We don't want to turn back time. Remember, when in response to the troubles of 2008, the federal government was virtually the only lender for home ownership. That was not a good role for FHA or Fannie or Freddie. Lenders, bankers, mortgage providers need to do everything possible to help credit-worthy millennials buy their first home. The taxpayer cannot be the sole solution. This is a time for aggressive responses in cities and communities that open opportunities. We need to do more. We need to stop punishing an entire generation for subprime crisis. And as we recover from that time, we must not overlook those trying to enter the market. One publication argues that millennials could become a powerhouse base for home ownership. That could be true if we set in place the right conditions and the correct responses. In my view, we can shape the future prosperity of this country by retrieving a lost generation and placing it on a firm foundation to wealth creation and future financial prosperity. And do recognize that early on in this country, our forefathers, pilgrims, were very brave, and they faced some tremendous odds. going across a rugged and hostile land and conquering all of those obstacles. There was something known as the can-do attitude that characterized America. Now we're in a different setting, a setting of fiscal austerity, and yet of great need. And that means that American ingenuity, that can-do spirit, must once again emerge, not just complaining and crying, but actually utilizing these incredible brains of ours to come up with innovative, exciting, and worthwhile innovations that will allow the American dream to flourish in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Mr. Secretary. We've got time for a few questions. I appreciate you staying to talk. Obviously, I think one of the areas that the housing community is probably most anxious about is related to the budget that's been proposed by the administration. And I think you've said in the past that you don't expect anyone to get kicked out of housing, but I think whether the issues of reductions in housing choice vouchers or public housing properties that can't exist on sufficient funds, resident who can't afford a higher payment, or rental assistance provided by home, that feels like a difficulty to achieve. And so I wanted to give you a chance to talk about what's going to give and how will we sort of achieve keeping folks from losing their housing if HUD's budget's going to shrink by $7 billion?
Sure. A very good question. CDBG, home, are actually not the primary mechanisms for rental assistance. It's Section 8, tenant-based and project-based rental assistance and public housing. And, you know, given the fiscal restraints, we have to prioritize in terms of which things we're going to really emphasize. You know, there are millions of families, 4.6 million households that are assisted through rental assistance programs. We want to make sure that all of those people continue to be assisted. So that's priority number one. Having said that, you know, some of the things through some of the other programs have been very helpful, particularly looking at the ability to leverage monies in order to provide more units. The rental assistance demonstration, perfect example of that, being able to create a lot more units than we're losing on an annual basis with public-private partnerships, and wiping out, you know, the backlog of capital needs at the same time automatically, and investing the local community in the well-being of those neighborhoods and projects. The old model was the government came in with a boatload of money and said, build this facility for veterans, build this facility for the homeless, build this facility for these low-income people, and off to the next project. And that's left us with a lot of housing infrastructure problems. The new model, government comes in, seeds the project, facilitates the public-private partnerships. There's a lot more money in the private sector than there is in the government. And at the same time, looks out for the next generation. Those are the kinds of priorities that we must put in place.
Thank you. The next question is, more than 50 communities, including some states, have ended veterans homelessness. Other communities are on a path to do that as well. The Housing First model shows real potential for ending homelessness for many other groups. Do you plan on building on this model, on this momentum, and if so, how?
Absolutely. As far as veterans are concerned, you know, we have a strong relationship with the VA and HUD from the street to the main offices. And there's been a lot of other groups also who have focused on veterans' homelessness to the point that it's been reduced by 47%. Can't gloat about that, but significant progress is being made. Our homeless assistance grants requesting $2.25 billion. Our emergency solutions grants $255 million will support over 350,000 in homeless shelters. So we're looking at that. Homelessness has been reduced from 800,000 to just over 500,000. Again, nothing to gloat about, but we're moving in the right directions. I think the housing first concept is an excellent concept. And the reason I say that is because somebody sleeping under a bridge, they're likely to end up in the emergency room sometime in the course of that year and be admitted to the hospital. A 1-week stay in the hospital costs more than it costs to house them for 3 years. So, you know, we have to look at the data. We have to utilize that appropriately. So housing first, I agree with, but we also must add housing second and housing third. Housing second means we need to diagnose the reason that they're in that situation, and housing third means we need to address that. And that's what real compassion is, putting people on a pathway to self-sustaining.
Great. You mentioned FHA in your opening remarks, and obviously it's played a pretty big role in helping first-time home buyers with access to safe and sustainable mortgages. And it plays a comparable role financing affordable rental housing as well. Many of our members have questions about future FHA policy, including the mortgage insurance premium reduction that is stalled, a final rule on FHA's condominium policy, multifamily transformational initiative, and resolving concerns about the use of the False Claims Act. Are you contemplating any policy changes for FHA in either single family or multifamily at this point?
Yes, but I can't talk about them in this forum. Yeah, there are a lot of interesting things that need to happen. Certainly, you know, as far as the condo rule is concerned, we're going to be looking at that carefully and making sure it's consistent with our goals of increasing home ownership, particularly in a stepwise fashion. You know, looking at some of the impediments to lenders getting involved, False Claims Acts and things like that. You know, clearly, the rules are important, and we're making sure that people understand what the rules are in single family and multifamily, no question about that. But finding ways to take some of the obstacles out of the way. And, you know, some of the mistakes that are made are non-material mistakes, and yet, you know, they lead to a lot of complications, delay of time, and those are things that push people out of the market. We're looking at those carefully, trimming those out of the way, only looking at material effects. Actually, last month, we instituted the lender electronic assessment tool that allows people to gain their certification and recertification online. And that also integrates a process that kicks out, you know, non-material errors. So, you know, those kinds of modernization tools obviously are going to make a huge difference. And we are looking forward to having a new FHA commissioner in place and strengthening, you know, the whole infrastructure of our organization, running it much more like a business. I think everybody's going to find it much easier to work with.
And I will not attempt to look around the audience at who that commissioner might be. I want to go back, talk on something that came up in the election. Certainly there was this sense of rural voters in particular feeling an expression of dissatisfaction of being left out of the economic growth of the country and being abandoned. Both USDA and HUD have played an important role in different aspects of rural housing. How do you see HUD's response and responsibility to rural America's housing needs?
Well, we actually have a very strong relationship between HUD and the Department of Agriculture, recognizing that, we have joint interest, and we're looking at ways to amalgamate those interests in a most efficient way. Now, interestingly enough, there are more severely affected people in terms of housing in our metropolitan and city areas than there are in the rural areas. But that doesn't mean that they're any less important. And we are going to continue to focus on that. You have your 515 program through the Department of Agriculture. You have our various housing and rental assistance programs. And again, we're looking at ways to streamline and maximize the effectiveness of that so that we can actually help more rather than less people.
Great, thank you. HUD plays several important roles in fair housing and equal opportunity. It supports programs to prevent or eliminate discriminatory housing practices. With the Department of Justice, it enforces anti-discrimination requirements. Are you planning any changes to HUD's enforcement and implementation of the Fair Housing Act?
Well, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which was modified in 1988, I think is one of the most beautiful pieces of legislation that we've ever crafted in a bipartisan fashion. And I will not only look to make sure that we continue, but to enhance everything we can to make all housing policies fair for every group in our society.
Thank you, thank you. So I want to come back to a point you mentioned about RAD and the success we've seen in the rental area demonstration project in recapitalizing public housing and older properties. You've been vocal of support of public-private partnerships. I think the conundrum for folks is that the proposed elimination of home, CDBG, Housing Trust Fund, the Capital Magnet Fund are essential elements to this recapitalization. So how do you envision the provision of RAD to work within that sort of conflict of cuts to those programs?
Well, actually, RAD itself, we need to lift the cap on that so that we can spread that much further and much faster. We see that it works. I've been on a national tour in a number of cities and seen what's happening with those programs. It's a win-win situation. We also have the ability to modify some of the programs in order to make sure that we enhance those public-private partnerships, the use of low-income housing tax credits and other incentives in order to bring in much more revenue. And it's not just a matter of bringing in the revenue. It's a matter of bringing in the interest. And there are a lot of things that we're doing that are outside of the budget. For instance, the creation of vision/opportunity centers. These will be all privately funded, but repurposed buildings that are frequently boarded up in low-income neighborhoods. Because you ask the children in those neighborhoods, what do you want to do when you grow up? You'll get about 5 answers, but there's 1,000 answers. And we want to bring in people who can show them those other 995 answers and how you get there. And we want to bring in child care, because so many of the young women get pregnant, their education ends, and that's problematic. But we want to give them a chance to get that GED, the associate's degree, the bachelor's degree, the master's degree, take control of their own lives, teach their children to take control of their own lives, which breaks the cycle. Mentorship programs have been shown to greatly reduce high school dropouts. So using those as focuses for mentorship programs and teaching people basic skills. When I was in high school, I knew basic skills. I knew how to use a lathe and a drill press and build an electric motor. They don't teach kids that stuff anymore. We need to give people basic skills once again. So we're going to be doing all of this through private funding, because there is an enormous amount of goodwill in our country. It just needs to be focused and directed.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you being with us, and we look forward to more conversations in the future. Please join me in thanking Secretary Carson.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So thank you all.